husband wanted. I'm aware that this is unconventional. Believe me, I've tried conventional, it didn't end well for anyone. I require a certain open-mindedness that I'm hoping I might find here, but more importantly, I need my future husband to know the rules. Meet cutes are well and good on the screen, but they don't guarantee a partner's ability to follow basic instructions. That was my mistake the first time. So, begging your pardon for my bluntness, I'm going to be clear about my requirements. Please read carefully. If you can't meet them, there's no point in going any further. Must want children. At least one child anyway. I'm open to the idea of more, but one is an absolute must. Must be in it for the long haul. Until our child turns 18, to be precise. I understand that level of commitment is a daunting prospect, particularly when we have not yet met. After our child is born, you are welcome to ignore me, if you please, or take your pleasure elsewhere, though I will warn you that it might be difficult to come by. But you will live under my roof until our child is an adult, homebody preferred. It will make the next 2 decades easier on you, must have impeccable manners. I will provide a manual outlining the required etiquette, but you must at least have a grasp of basic courtesy to begin with. If you let your tongue run away with you, or don't bother to wish your neighbors a good morning when you pass them in the street, stop reading. This is not the opportunity for you. Seriously. This is the part where I should talk about myself, but let's face it, this is hardly a romantic proposal. I require commitment up front, and there's no guarantee that, once we do meet, we'll really even like each other. If we do, fantastic. It'll help the years fly by. If we don't, you'll still have the main prize years of rent-free, expenses-free living at the Old Oak Hotel. A sanctuary has stood in this spot in one form or another since before the ley lines. During its tenure, it has been flooded, put to the flame, and pounded into dust. Time and again, it has been reimagined and rebuilt. Most of the current building dates back to Victoria's reign, though the oldest parts were constructed in the 13th century. At the very bottom of the garden, cut into the surrounding hills, there is a cave bearing handprints of red ochre. There has always been an Edwards at the hotel, though of course we haven't always gone by that name. You would think a family so tied to one place would do a better job of keeping records, but no one is certain of our origins. Perhaps it was a cosmic bargain, or perhaps mere luck, whether good or bad. I have never been able to decide. Either way, our presence is required. Throughout our spotty past, there's a story here and there of an Edwards deserting their post, and it always coincides with a particularly brutal period of history. I inherited the position 5 years ago. At midnight on my 18th birthday, my parents took their already packed suitcases and left. I don't blame them for their abandonment. I intend to one day do the same thing to my, or hopefully, our child. They send me postcards and photos from time to time, always smiling on sunny beaches. Money isn't a concern for them. That's part of whatever mysterious deal our ancestors made. When a caretaker leaves in good standing, they will never want for anything again. They could travel the world for the rest of their lives, always sleeping in the softest sheets and dining in the finest restaurants, and never find their pockets empty. Keep this point in mind, for if you can meet my requirements, you will share my good fortune. And what must we do in return? I can all but hear you scream the question. Why? Very little. The presence of an Edwards ensures that the guests can't stray from the hotel grounds. Most of our guests are live-in residents, though we do get the occasional walk-in. Where they come from, I don't know, for we are not visible to most people who stumble upon our lonely corner of the world. I've come to believe the hotel chooses to reveal itself when it's lacking entertainment, or to fill a need. Jimmy, my first husband, was one such guest. For the most part, the guests are harmless. They'll give you a little fright from time to time, popping out from a wall or turning your bathwater into blood. But I find it hard to hold it against them. I found 23 years here dreary. I can't imagine how bored I would be after 500. There are a few exceptions you should be aware of, Rick. Our resident serial murderer. He claims to have been Jack the Ripper while he still drew breath, but I think he's just a blowhard. He knows better than to harm an Edwards, but I'm afraid spouses are fair game. Years ago, my grandmother managed to confine him to the 4th floor, so you will be perfectly safe from him as long as you never set foot there. Occasionally, the lift will stop on that floor, even though you haven't pressed the button for it. Do not get out. Even if the lift appears to be on fire or starts filling with murky water, wait for the doors to close again, then go to another floor. It should only take a few hours, the thing in the cellar. I don't know what it is no one ever has. We only know it eats rats and must be fed once a day. If I'm ever ill or incapacitated, this task will fall to you. Harvest the rats from the traps in the garden, then stand at the cellar door and throw them down the stairs. Do not walk down the stairs and do not forget to feed it. You don't want to be the first person to see its face. Mrs. Jones. Old-fashioned and a stickler for manners, she's the reason I'm advertising for a husband rather than a boyfriend. She won't abide a couple living in sin under the same roof as her. Really though, she's a sweet old thing, full of stories about the war, and always ready to help if I get stuck on a recipe. I don't blame her for what happened with Jimmy at all. I'd warned him enough times. Guests aside, there are other rules you will need to follow to ensure a safe, satisfactory stay at the Old Oak Hotel. They are listed in a book that has been repenned many times over the centuries. If you choose to accept this opportunity, I will insist that you read it until you can recite the pages word for word. However, there are some rules so critical for your survival that I feel compelled to list them here. With the exception of the 4th floor, you are welcome to roam the hotel and its grounds as you please. But you must never set foot outside of our land, not until our child is old enough to fulfill their duties. If I were to do so, it would unleash pandemonium plague, peril, perhaps another world war. I'm afraid you would be less crucial to the fate of the world, but it would certainly be a personal disaster. Never look in the mirrors in room 33. I've touched this point already, but it bears repeating: never be rude to Mrs. Jones. Failure to observe that last rule is what got Jimmy. She doted on him. I think he reminded her of her long-dead son, for she pampered him as if he were one of her own. Each morning she had breakfast ready for him before I had so much as opened my eyes, and she developed a habit of trailing along after him, complimenting his skill as he oiled rusted hinges or set a crooked picture straight. At first, Jimmy basked in the attention. But by the end of his 2nd month, he was growing bored of Mrs. Jones, me, and the hotel itself. We pride ourselves on our facilities. If you need more activity than a turn around the garden, we have a lovely indoor pool that freezes over every now and then, but most of the time it's perfectly usable. Our library is unmatched. Although the room is cramped, it has every book imaginable. You only need to think of a particular title, and it will appear on one of the shelves. And now that I've dragged us kicking and screaming into the 21st century, we have a wide array of streaming services. It wasn't enough for Jimmy. He wanted to go out, eat in a restaurant, watch a film in the cinema, see any faces other than the ones he was surrounded by every day. He began having a drink each evening. One drink turned into several, and after a few weeks, the bar became his permanent residence between dusk and midnight. He wasn't the only one getting bored. I had been thrilled when he first arrived, ecstatic when he agreed to stay. How marvelous to feel real flesh beneath my fingers after 5 years of only the dead for company. What a relief to have some assistance in the many tasks required to keep the hotel running as it should. The more he drank, the less inclined he was to help or even spend time in my company. He no longer visited my bed, choosing a room for himself on the opposite end of the floor. When our paths did cross, at best he would ignore me. At worst, he would nitpick or outright rail against me, blaming me for his captivity. Still, I made an effort to be present whenever he frequented the bar. As lovely as Mrs. Jones can be, she does have a tendency to nag. Before and after her death, she was close to teetotal, only consenting to take a single sherry at Christmas, and drinking outside of special occasions is something of a bugbear of hers. Think of your health, dear, she would tell Jimmy brusquely. You'll miss it when it's gone. Or, how about we switch to a nice apple juice now? You've had quite enough to drink for one night. Most of the time, Jimmy managed to pull himself together enough to flash a charming smile and distract her with a compliment about her latest meal. But after one drink too many, I'd noticed him gritting his teeth and just barely managing to hold his tongue. It was better if I was present. Playing the doting wife, I insisted on pouring his drinks, watering them down out of his sight. When Mrs. Jones's nagging bordered on relentless, I could always distract her with a game of gin rummy. On his final day, I was running behind. The ghoul on the second floor, usually the least demanding of our guests, had come down with some dreadful illness, or else decided he wanted to inconvenience me. Either way, I had woken that morning to the foulest stench I had ever experienced. I followed it to his room and found every surface covered in putrid green blank gunge, its consistency somewhere between mucus and vomit. All day I scrubbed, taking only brief breaks to step outside before I fainted. By the time the room was restored to a passable state, and I had filled several bin bags to bursting with filthy rags, it was already deep into the night. Mindful of the time, I paused only long enough to wash the streaks of muck from my arms and face before racing to the bar. I arrived just in time to hear Jimmy's last words. After he spat them at Mrs. Jones, she only stared for a small eternity, her mouth frozen in the motherly smile she wore whenever she scolded him. Then, like melted wax, her face began to shift. I shouted at Jimmy to run, but he didn't need to be told. Before the words left my mouth, he leapt from his bar stool and streaked through the door. Mrs. Jones followed him seconds later. Her lips were already peeling back to reveal rows upon rows of long, wickedly sharp fangs, while claws sprouted from beneath her lace-edged cuffs. I sprinted after them, but Jimmy was fueled by fear and Mrs. Jones by whatever force propels the Mrs. Joneses of the world. I followed the screeching to the lobby. Breathless, I arrived to see he had arrived within mere feet of the entrance before Mrs. Jones grabbed him. Claws wrapped around his throat, she lifted him into the air. As I watched, her jaw unhinged, the lower part dropping so that it was nearly level with her chest. That sight drove all the sense out of my head. Forgetting every rule my parents had ever drilled into me, I lunged at her. She batted me away as though I weighed no more than a fly. I crashed into the reception desk, the breath bursting from my lungs in a great whoosh. I was certain that I would die, for no amount of effort seemed to force air back into my aching chest. At last, as my vision began to dim, I managed to take a small gulp, then another, and another, until I was able to draw myself together enough to regain my feet. By that time, Mrs. Jones had nearly finished her dinner. Jimmy's chest was splayed open, muscle and shattered ribs protruding every which way from his flesh, and she was devouring the last few bites of his heart. His head was angled towards me. The light had winked out from his eyes, but they still held his final terror and an accusation which, I was quite certain, was directed at me. I would like to say I felt only horror, but I couldn't help my sudden jolt of irritation. How many times had I told him to mind his manners? Mrs. Jones gulped, the sound thick and wet in her gullet, and dropped what remained of Jimmy to the floor. Then she turned to me. Here's another rule for you, one which I hope you never have cause to use: never interfere with a kill. The Mrs. Jones who used to kiss my grazed knees, who argued with my mother for the right to read me bedtime stories, was no longer at the wheel. No amount of pleading or reasoning would move her. I could only run. Spinning around, I vaulted over the reception desk and raced for the office behind it. If Jimmy had not been out of his mind with fear and booze, he might have remembered the rules and survived. It was one of several staff-only rooms throughout the hotel warded to keep out unwanted guests. Just 10 steps from desk to door, yet it was the longest journey of my life. My hard-won breath burned my throat, my heart pounded in my ears, deafening me to all other sounds than Mrs. Jones's heavy, pounding footsteps. Grasping the handle, her hot, copper-tanged breath was on my neck. Fire exploded in my flesh as she raked her claws down my back. A step further away, and I wouldn't have made it. The pain would have been too great. But I managed to throw myself into the office and slam the door before crumpling to the ground. Before I passed out, I heard her grunting and shrieking outside, furious that she couldn't get in. 3 days I spent in the office, emerging only to feed the thing in the cellar before scurrying back to my hiding place. Whenever I left, I tried not to look at the mangled heap that used to be Jimmy. There was no avoiding the smell, though. With no small difficulty, and the help of a first aid kit, I managed to treat and bandage the wounds on my back. They bled sluggishly all throughout the first day, but thankfully didn't fester. On the morning of the 4th day, there was a tentative knock on the door, followed by the sound of rapidly retreating footsteps. I waited until they had disappeared down the corridor before cracking the door open. On the floor was a freshly baked Victoria sponge and a beautifully written note of apology. It took every ounce of courage I possessed, but that evening I forced myself to go to the dining room. Mrs. Jones was waiting for me, her eyes red-rimmed, a steaming cottage pie on the table. I tried not to flinch as she took my hand, reiterating the apology she had already delivered in writing. The next morning, she helped me clean Jimmy up. We treated each other cautiously for a while, but eventually we got back to playing gin rummy again. When the scars on my back twinge, as they sometimes do, she helps me rub a soothing ointment into them. Even though I've told her it's not necessary, she apologizes every time. So, you've heard my story and you have my proposal. If you think you could be the man for me, I invite you to visit. You will need to drink a cup of ram's blood, a pinch of nutmeg makes it a little more tolerable, and light a black candle before bedtime. When you next wake, you will find yourself at our gates. As travel arrangements go, it's hardly the Orient Express, but it beats the airfare. If you have read this without flinching, if you can stomach the journey to get here, if you walk up to our door and find the nerve to open it, I have one more instruction for you. Just as you enter, look to your right. You will see a deep brown stain on the lobby carpet. I've scrubbed and scrubbed and scrubbed, but it just won't come out. Perhaps that's for the best. It's a good reminder of what will happen to you should you call Mrs. Jones a nosy old bat. And when you run into Jimmy, as you will, for he still likes hanging around the bar in the evening, his silvery wounds glistening as though they had just been inflicted, don't let him convince you he was some sort of victim. He knew the rules.